that happened 50 years ago in San Francisco under the sponsorship of the National Institute of Mental Health, of all things. And okay, so that's one thing. I'm going to talk now about, I've been studying ayahuasca for almost 45 years. It's been a personal passion of mine, a spiritual teacher, and also an object of my career and professional scientific work. So I'm going to share parts of each of those things with you, hopefully in enough time that there'll be some time for questions and answers after that. I want to mention the Heffter Research Institute, which is a nonprofit, heffter.org. I'm a founding board member, and it's one of the ones, how many here have heard of MAPS? How many have heard of Heffter? Not so many, right. So Heffter is the one that we're lousy at PR, but we're very good at research, and we're kind of leading the charge when it comes to psilocybin. Most of the clinical work that's being done with psilocybin under FDA-approved protocols is happening with Heffter, and most of the researchers are either being supported by Heffter or on our board or both. So you can check out heffter.org and see what we're doing. Look at the research page to get an idea of what's going on. So, how many of you are familiar with ayahuasca? Many. How many have consumed it, if you want to admit it? Enough. How many know some of the details behind the botany and the chemistry and the pharmacology and all that? A few of you, right. So I'm not going to snow you with that. We're going to take a very superficial look at that, but enough to help ground you if you're interested in these things. As you know, ayahuasca is always made from Banisteriopsis caapi, which is the one on the left. It's a huge jungle liana, gets to be an incredible size, and either one or another of two admixture plants. The one in the middle is the most commonly used. It's called chacruna. It's scientifically, it's the Psychotria viridis, and it's the rubiaceae. How many botanists here in this crowd? What other famous plant is in the rubiaceae? Try coffee. Coffee is in the rubiaceae, which is one reason why you can grow a lot of chacruna in Hawaii, and there is indeed a lot of it being grown in Hawaii, because they just think it's coffee, you know. And it's not an illegal plant. The substance in it is a controlled substance, but not dimethyltryptamine, but not the plant itself. Another admixture plant, which is found north of the Putumayo, is called Diploteris cabarena. It's another alternative source of dimethyltryptamine, and actually makes the difference between, you've heard of yahe possibly. Yahe is ayahuasca prepared with Diploteris, and ayahuasca, which is used mostly through the basin, is prepared with Psychotria viridis. And why is he lying? Can we just bring it down and leave it down, or leave it halfway on, or what? Or you're trying to undermine my talk here. So I am one of the people, probably one of the first people to introduce ayahuasca to Hawaii, where it's now spread all over the world, and there's a lot of ayahuasca being grown in Hawaii. So this, it's a huge plant. This one on the left is the mother plant. I brought that to my brothers and his wife at the time land on the Big Island in 1976. And it's now got a main stem that's the size of a small tree. It weighs several tons. These are not shrinking violet type plants. So ayahuasca is a huge plant, weighing many tons, the mature ones. And then the Psychotria viridis, the chacruna, they're a large bush if they're allowed to grow enough. And ayahuasca, as you most probably know, has a unique pharmacology. Its psychoactivity depends on a synergy between two classes of active compounds. The leaf admixtures, the Psychotria or the Diploteris that contain dimethyltryptamine, And that's the component that gives it its psychedelic properties, its visionary kick, if you will. But dimethyltryptamine is not active orally, and the reason that it's not is it's inactivated by enzymes in the gut called monoamine oxidases. Well, it turns out that if you block monoamine oxidase, then DMT can be rendered orally active and absorbed in the normal way and reach the brain undegraded. The alkaloids of the vine, the Banisteriopsis, happen to be very potent, reversible inhibitors of monoamine oxidase. So somehow these ignorant savages have figured out how to prepare a very, very sophisticated pharmaceutical preparation. How do you know, out of all the 80,000 species of plants in the Amazon, how to take just these two that work synergistically together to produce ayahuasca, a very potent brew? So we can talk a bit about the chemistry of these things. The alkaloids in ayahuasca are the ones in the middle, so-called beta-carbolines, primarily harmine, harmaline, and tetrahydroharmine. These are all potent inhibitors of monoamine oxidase. And tetrahydroharmine has other properties. It's also a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Not extremely potent, but it does have that property. And then dimethyltryptamine on the right there. Very simple compound, orally inactive. You have to smoke it or inject it. And there are tribes in the Amazon that use DMT-containing plants as snuffs, so they get around it that way. But ayahuasca is obviously a beverage, so that's the combination that gives the magic. And just kind of a trivial diagram, a little of how it works. You've got DMT, normally would be degraded to indole acetic acid by MAO. Beta-carbolines will block that reaction. Okay? So I first got deeply into ayahuasca, or I began to get into it in 1981 when I went to the Amazon as a graduate student at the University of British Columbia. And I focused my research on ayahuasca and another indigenous hallucinogen called ukuhe, another orally active DMT preparation, which I'm not going to talk about at all, because nobody's heard of ukuhe and it's kind of disappearing knowledge and nobody cares anything. But a lot of people care about ayahuasca. It's become, emerged on a global stage, as you know. And this fellow, I knew when I came to Pucallpa, Peru, that he was there because my brother Terrence and his wife, Kat, had been there a couple of years before and spent some time with them. So when we got to Pucallpa, we knew we wanted to track down Don Fidel, and he turned out to be an amazing person. Much more, he doesn't look very amazing, but he is. He was a very knowledgeable person. He knew how to prepare ayahuasca, obviously, how to use many other plants. He had the ceremonies down, and on top of all that, he was very kind and willing to share his knowledge. And you can imagine two utterly clueless gringos speaking hardly any Spanish, come to his house and say, "Tell us everything you know about ayahuasca." Yeah, sure, okay, whatever. But he was kind enough to let us observe the preparation of ayahuasca several times, collect samples, take it with him and his colleagues and learn about it that way, and then take those samples back to the university so I could do analysis on it. So he was, a the best informant that I could have hoped for at the time. And there are many people that use ayahuasca that are not that knowledgeable. He wasn't one of them. He was very knowledgeable, and he was willing to share. He understood the value of science and why it was important to look into this. At about the same time that I was doing this work in Pucallpa, my colleague, and still my colleague, still a very close friend, Luis Eduardo Luna, who's probably the best well-known ethnographer of ayahuasca, was doing work up near Iquitos. And he was in the process of making a film about ayahuasca with his friends, and he was studying the mestizo tradition of ayahuasca up there, not indigenous, but these are mestizos, and generically we call it vegetalismo. He was studying people that practiced vegetalismo. And he had an informant that turned out to be his primary informant, Don Emilio Andrade, that he spent most of his time with. And Don Emilio and actually Don Fidel were part of this lineage of what I call the old school of ayahuasqueros. And they share a similar practice, similar songs, similar understanding of what ayahuasca is and how to use it and so on. So Eduardo completed his film, which was called Don Emilio and His Little Doctors, or Don Emilio y sus doctorcitos, sounds a little better in Spanish. It's on YouTube, and you can watch it. And there have been many, many documentaries made about ayahuasca. His was one of the first. It was crude as far as the filmmaking quality was concerned, but in some way I think it's one of the best, because it's actually just filming Don Emilio talking about his life and his belief as he goes about his business. And it's really a touching, moving story. And here is another famous ayahuasquero who is part of this old school around Iquitos. Don Jose Corral was famous for his icaros, famous for his singing and his healing abilities. And I have been privileged to have a couple of sessions with him, and he was really amazing. The last time I encountered him was 2006 at the age of 99. And he passed on not long after this picture was taken, but he was also an amazing, amazing practitioner. They don't make them like they used to. This fellow is also very significant in my life, very important person. He's not an ayahuasquero, he's a botanist. And he runs, at the time he was just a student in 1981, who the then curator of the herbarium told him, I'm sure, the conversation was something like, take these gringos out, they have no idea what they're doing, at least make sure they get back alive, right? And he did that, but over the period of 30, 40 years that I've known him, we've worked together on many projects. And he is one of these people about whom it's said, if a medicine man dies, it's like a library has burned down. And this man is a living library, and he knows. I have never been able to hand him a plant that he can't identify, usually never needs to consult a book or anything. He just can tell you, and usually the specimens are not in good shape, a fragment of leaf, a piece of bark. I think he knows every plant in the Loreto region around Iquitos personally, and he just has amazing, amazing knowledge, and plus he's a hoot to hang out with. He's very funny, and he has stories about all the botanists that have come through over the years who would have got nothing done if it hadn't been for him. And I have to say, I wouldn't have my PhD if it wasn't for Juan Ruiz. I still work with him, and I love him dearly. Well, eventually, after doing my field work, I spent about 6 months there, going different parts of Peru, collecting samples. Eventually got those samples back and herbarium specimens and so on into the lab, where I spent the next 3 years sorting all this out, looking at the chemistry and the pharmacology of ayahuasca, fractionating them, look at the active principles and so on. I had plant import permits and all this, so I wasn't worried about importing my plants, but I took a red eye from Lima to Vancouver, got into Vancouver about 4 in the morning, had duffel bags full of stuff, plant trusts, and I looked pretty rough. I'd been in the jungle for some months. I get to the customs and I kind of like dump this duffel bag all over the table. I said, do you want to see my permits? And it was 4 in the morning. It's this young woman, customs agent, and she took a look at me and she took a look at what I was presenting. She said, you're the people my supervisor warned me about. I said, yeah, but I got my permits right here. She said, I don't want to see them. Pack your stuff up and get out of here. I was happy to do that. So anyway, legal and everything. So after about 3 or 4 years studying that, I do what all graduate students are supposed to do, and I published my first papers about this. And this was in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology, which was just getting started at the time. I published 2 papers, one about ayahuasca, and the other one about the ukuhe, the myristicaceous hallucinogens, which myristicaceae is the nutmeg family. And the genus of interest is Varola. Varola is the genus, and the sap of Varola is full of DMT and other tryptamines. Used as snuff by some tribes, but used as an orally active preparation by 2 or 3 tribes. It's really a disappearing tradition. Many people, even the tribes that had it, don't remember exactly how to use it. And ayahuasca, on the other hand, has gone on to become the superstar of psychedelics. It's on a global stage now. Another paper that we published, which amounted to little more than a literature review, Luis Eduardo Luna and I published a paper together because he had been studying with his informants up in Iquitos. He had been studying what they call the plant teachers, or the pharmacopoeia of plants that is associated with ayahuasca. They're not always taken with ayahuasca, they're usually not, but they may be used in, as part of the dieta, of training that ayahuasqueros undergo to learn their craft. And there's about 150 species that are what you might call the ayahuasca pharmacopoeia, or the ayahuasca botanical complex. Most of them are uninvestigated from a chemical point of view. And so we put together a literature search and published a paper originally in America, Indígena in Spanish, and then later in an anthology. And the title was Biodynamic Constituents in Ayahuasca Admixture Plants, an uninvestigated folk pharmacopoeia. Why do we care? Well, looking at plants where you don't have a firm handle on what the active ingredients are is of interest, because you never know when something is going to turn up that is a new structure and possibly has a new mechanism of action. So a quick summary of this, we looked at about 52 genera that were recorded in the literature, and of those, 23% of them were purported hallucinogens in their own right, plants that were not used with ayahuasca, but were reputed to have hallucinogenic properties. And then of the others, 11% had unknown constituents, and the other 6 had indole alkaloids. Indole alkaloids are a class of alkaloids where you often find psychoactivity. 2% had other type alkaloids, 4% had non-alkaloidal constituents. So this is still an area that's been poorly investigated. This work was published around 1983. Eventually, this was published in 95, but no, this was published around 1986 or so. We did a redo of this in the MAPS conference for 2013. It was 2013. We thought we were going to give an update on the investigation in these admixture plants, assuming that all of this work had gone on in 30 years, right? Surely there was a lot more that had been learned. Very little work had been done. So there's just not, when you say about an Amazonian plant that it's been well investigated, that usually means you're lucky if there's a dozen papers about it. I mean, that's a lot of papers. So most of the Amazonian pharmacopoeia is just not really, well studied at all. So in 1985, I'd finished my PhD. I was doing a postdoc in San Diego about nothing very interesting. And I was invited to a symposium that Eduardo had organized for the International Congress of the Americanists. He